Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, this week we have been trying to understand the different theories on population. We try to understand starting from the Malthus to demographic transition theory. And in four lectures we have tried to cover a great detail of all this. Today we will move further and will try to understand the remaining theories, the remaining important theories like post-demographic transition theory, optimum population theory, then revisionist theory, and in the last we will try to understand what are the current discourses in international conference regarding the population growth and population theory. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in studio the same resource person, Dr. Abhay Kumar. He is presently working in the Institute for Human Development and has done PhD on population study from the Center for Study of Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, a premier university of the country, and has done a lot of work on this very issue. So, and presented a number of research papers, brought out a research report and the book on not only population theory but other diverse issues like livelihood, workers, poverty, and human development. Recently, he has produced a Delhi Development Report, which is very has been appreciated by the scholars. And apart from this, Dr. Kumar is also a member of Technical Advisory Committee on in Indian Association of Parliamentarian on Population and Development, and he also visiting faculty at different university like Jamia Millia Islamia University, National Institute, National Labour Institute, VV Giri National Labour Institute, and also Institute of Food Security in Central Training Institute of Food Corporation of India. So I think his knowledge and practical exposure to various issues has given a new dimension to his thinking and thought. So certainly he will help explain us and will also today sum up what we have learned in the last few lectures. So without taking much time, I invite him for the EduSet lecture and to request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Aminderji. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, friends. This is the fifth lecture in a series of 5 lectures on the population theories that we are covering. We started with Marx, then we started with Malthus, and then we discussed Marx. Then we discussed Ricardo. We also discussed the neo-Malthusian theories. Then we also discussed some of the theories of the optimist categories. And then in my previous lecture, I tried to discuss about the demographic transition theory given by Notestein and Thompson. Yesterday, we discussed about the demographic transition, wherein I tried to discuss about the different stages of the population, growth, population increase, and the different stages of the birth rate and death rate at the way as and when the society progresses from pre-modern to the post-modern phase. So this is what we discussed in the demographic transition. Now today I am going to discuss a great detail about the what happens after the demographic transition stages gets over in different societies. Friends, as we have experienced that in the developed world, most of the countries have already crossed all the stages of the demographic transition. Now the question is, what next? What kind of transition does those countries are experiencing right now? And to discuss that, I will discuss in brief about this particular fact of the post-demographic transition, taking a help of some of the recent literatures. Besides, I will also try to explain the demographic regimes. After discussing this, I will try to discuss in brief about the optimum population theory, which I have not covered in this lecture series. After optimum population theory, I will also try to discuss in brief about the revisionist theory, which is also known as the neutralist theory. After the revisionist theory, I will then try to discuss some of the discourses that are taking place in these various international conferences conducted by the United Nations, where all the government, all the countries participate. So, these are the 4 different theories that I am going to discuss today. Besides, at the end I will try to sum up all the theories together to complete this lecture series on population theories. So, to begin with, now the question is, as we know friends, that most of the developed countries have already crossed the demographic transition stages. Say for example Germany, say for example Japan, say for example France, all these countries have already, all the Nordic countries, say Sweden, Norway, Finland, these countries have already crossed the demographic transition stages. Now the question is, what kind of transition these countries are experiencing? Now on this there are a number of discourses, there are a number of arguments. In a very interesting paper which has recently been brought by Chris Wilson in a journal called Demographic Research, I am going to take the help of that particular paper to explain some of the discourses that are going on in the sphere of the population theories. So in the paper written by Chris Wilson, which was published very recently, almost a couple of months back, there are various interesting discourses that is going on. You know, United Nations has predicted that there will come a time that all the countries of the world will have a homogeneous birth rate, death rate and natural growth rate. So this was a prediction largely made on the basis of the demographic transition. This particular prediction that ultimately or at finally what we will have is a homogeneous world where each countries will have a low birth rate, low death rate and low population growth rate. Now the question is this a possible argument? Now there are several studies which have indicated that this may not happen, and that is why it is told that it is a shaky idea. It is not a confirmed idea, it is a shaky idea, and it is an implausible endpoint of the demographic post-demographic transition. So this is not a plausible suggestion that all the countries at the end of the demographic transition in reality will witness a homogeneous birth rate, death rate and natural and population growth rate. Chris Wilson in his paper has cited a very famous study by Francis Fukuyama, his book called The End of History, wherein Fukuyama has tried to argue that this, the democratic system, the liberal democratic system that has evolved in the world is the end of the human thinking, is the end of the socio-political development of this world, and that is why he named his book as The End of History. So this is what the Chris Wilson tried to say, that is this the homogeneous world, are we going to experience the homogeneous world at the end of the demographic transition experienced by all the countries? Basically Chris Wilson in his paper sees that this is not going to be a possibility, and he cites a number of other examples to prove his point. Now he says that there striking evidences which contradicts this viewpoint that modernization or the post-demographic modernization will sweep away all the traces of earlier diversity. So, earlier there were lots of diversity of the varying death rate, birth rate and the different socio-cultural environment, so the socio-cultural development, the socio-economic development, wherein at the end of the demographic transition all the countries will have the similar socio-economic development as well as the demographic development. So, he says that there are striking evidences which contradicts this viewpoint. And what are those? He suggests one example, and he says that sex selective abortion, or say the son preference, is one of the most strongest preference in the modern time, even inside the developed world. And there is a very famous study by Gilmoto conducted in 2009, wherein he has shown that starting from the United States, starting from the Russia to Middle East to all the Asian countries as well as many of the developed countries, there are cases of sex selective abortions and the preference for son, and these kind of things have not been reflected in the demographic transition theory. So, there is an argument which suggests that these kind of varying pattern of varying demographic pattern will keep on emerging in the societies, and that is why we may not have a situation where we will have a uniform or homogenic demographic structure in the entire world. So, he suggests that there will be a demographic heterogeneity and that the impact of initial conditions may be hidden. He suggests that there will be a cases that many of the initial conditions will be hidden and it might re-emerge at the later stage. So, during the demographic transition it may not get reflected, it may not get highlighted, but later on at the later stages these hidden conditions might get highlighted even in the modern societies. So, he was citing the example of the sex selective abortions. Similarly, he said that there might be more similarities than is often appreciated. So, basically his argument was that he is not seeing a uniform demographic pattern in the world after the completion of the demographic transition stages in the entire world. So, this was one argument. Secondly, he discusses about the post demographic transitions. Now, the question is what happens when the developed countries, we have already seen that the developed countries have crossed the different stages of the demographic transition. Now, the question is what happens and what are the current situation, current stages in which these demographically developed countries are moving towards. So, he said that the demographic transition that was discussed earlier was called as the first transition phase, but he cites that there may be second and third transition phase which might come after the first transition or the first demographic transition. And now, what will be the characteristics of these second and third transitions? He said that in the second transition, which will be immediately after the completion of the first demographic transition, all the stages of the first demographic transition, he suggests that this second transition refers to rapid fall in the fertility to the below replacement level in the industrially advanced country, which I just said that in the second transition what will happen, that there will be a rapid fall in the fertility, even it will go below the replacement level, and then there will be a negative population growth rate. That will be the characteristics of the second demographic transition. He said that there might be even a third transition phase in which he is referring to an increase in the fertility in the lowest low fertility countries. Lowest low fertility countries, that means those countries which have already attained a very low level of fertility. So, he said that there might be an increase in the fertility level in those countries. He but suggests that the mechanism of the increase in the fertility rate of these countries in the third transition period is not yet clear and is a matter of a study. And he also suggests that it will be very difficult to say that whether these societies will experience increased fertility immediately after the second transition and in what condition. After this first, second and third transition, he suggests, he also discusses about a demographic regime. Now, he said that demographic regime is a concept which is basically a combination of interrelated demographic characteristics that pertains to a given population. Basically, this particular concept of demographic regime was given by Landry, Adolph Landry in 1934, but for a long time this concept was not, did not get into the mainstream scholarship, and later on in 1985 a dictionary of demography came wherein Prasad tried to define the terminology of demographic regime. Now, what is this demographic regime? Demographic regime is a combination of interrelated demographic characteristics that pertains in a given population. For instance, Prasad said that there might be a situation where fertility and mortality will be in a balanced stage and the social arrangement will be such that this balance will be maintained. And if that such situation occurs, then that particular situation or that particular stage will be called a demographically homeostatic regime. So, this is what Prasad tried to define the demographic regime. Basically, he said that demographic regime can be seen. So, there was one demographic transition period. So, he said that demographic transition period was one regime, but prior to the demographic transition there was a pre-transitional regime. It was a time when the demographic transition stages started. Even before that there was a pre-transitional regime. And what was the characteristics of the pre-transitional regime? The rate of population growth was close to zero because of the high fluctuations in the birth rate and death rate because of the epidemic mortality, which we have already discussed in the stage 1 of the demographic transition. And because of that, there will be an equilibrium in the population growth which will maintain a zero population growth rate. Why? And this is mainly because the number of births taking place will be equal to the number of deaths taking place in that particular society. So, this was some of the characteristics of the pre-transitional regime. He also discussed about the life expectancy at birth, when he said that the life expectancy was not more than 20 to 40 years life expectancy at birth. So, this was some of the characteristics of the demographic regime, the pre-transitional regime or the pre-transitional demographic regime. He also discusses about the post-transitional regime. Now, in this particular post-transitional regime, he again suggested some of the characteristics that this post-transitional regime may have. So, what will be the characteristics of this post-transitional regime? The basic characteristics of this post-transitional regime will be, it will have an affluent society. All the demographically developed or the socio-economically developed countries, even including China, will come under the post-transitional regime. They will have a longer life, they will have a longer duration of life or longer expectancy of life at birth. The population growth will be below replacement level or the below replacement, and then there will be a very large or the increasing rate of the elderly population in those societies. So, in the post-transitional regime, there will be a characteristics of the post-demographic transition phase. So, these are also the characteristics that we have seen in the post-demographical phase or when the demographic transition completes. So, these are some of the characteristics. He also suggests about the immigration from the poorer areas in appreciable number. So this was also one of the new addition to this demographic post-transitional regime. So the slowly and steadily, as we have discussed in the criticism of the demographic transition theory, that it considered only the difference between the birth rate and death rate, whereas it has ignored the factors of migration or the net migration into it. So now the factors of the migration is coming up in the post-transitional regime. So there will be appreciable immigration from the poorer areas, and that will be considered into the theory. And also, as we all know, mortality before the end of the reproductive period is negligible. So the mortality, because the life expectancy has gone up, and because of that very fewer people will die before the age of their reproductive period, which is say 50 years or 60 years time. Now there is an interplay of fertility and migration which has been reflected by several studies globally. Now what are these interplays? There are very interesting studies coming up in the current years, wherein it has been shown, like a study done by, as you can see, Miskila, Kohler and Billari in 2009 did a study wherein they found that in developed countries which have higher human development indices, which have higher human development, tends to have the relatively higher fertility. So this is a new pattern that is coming up, that in the developed countries, which is in the post-demographic transition phase, where there is a better human development indicators, where there are better human development indices, they tend to have relatively higher fertility than the developed countries which have the lower human development indicators or lower human development outcomes. So these are the new studies coming up in the current years, which suggest some of the post-transitional characteristics or post-transitional structures which is going to come in the future. There are also studies which suggest, there was a study done by MacDonald in 2000, in year 2000, and it was later updated in 2013, which suggests that in developed countries which have already gone to the post-transitional phase, where there is more gender equality, where there is more gender empowerment, those countries have relatively higher fertility rate than the developed countries which have a lesser gender equality or lesser gender empowerment. These are the crucial facts that is coming up in the developed countries, in the studies of the developed countries, wherein we can see that the better human development indicators, better gender parity, better gender empowerment, all these things are leading to relatively higher fertility than the developed countries which have lesser gender equality and lesser human development outcomes. So these are the new current patterns that is emerging in the post-transitional phase, which needs to be highlighted, and that has been also highlighted in the CRISP paper. Now as a result, what happens, the way these papers have shown that there is a relative increase in the fertility in the countries, in the developed countries where there is higher human development, higher gender parity, higher gender empowerment. So there is a case that we may not see a population decline scenario in the future. So this is one of the case that is being argued in the post-demographic phase. Rich countries also have another factor, very important factor in there, that these rich countries where they have already brought their fertility or the growth of population below the replacement level, there is a very higher cases of the migration, or there is very higher cases of immigration. So there are rich countries which draws migrants from the global labor pool. As you know, as you can recall the Marxian theory, where they said that there is a reserved army of labor, and that is not restricted to a closed society, but that also have a reserved army of labor from the international global labor market. So here again we are experiencing that rich countries are having more and more immigration, and that is how their low level of fertility, their low level of population growth is being compensated. So these are the new discourses, these are the current thinking that is going on in the post demographical transition phase. Now in the Chris paper, he suggests that in the post demographic scenario, all those developed countries which have already crossed the post demographic scenario, there can be 4 different regimes, or there can be 4 different demographic regimes. And what are these 4 different demographic regimes? He classifies the demographically developed countries into 4 different demographic regimes, and these are shown here. That the first regime will be the northwestern Europe, including England, France, Germany and all. There will be North America, and there will be Australasia, including Australia and New Zealand. So this will be the first regime in the this will be the first current regime, which will have the characteristics that their fertility will be relatively higher, only a little below replacement level, but there will be very, very high immigration. So their fertility will be relatively higher from the other developed countries, but the immigration in these countries will be higher from the other parts of the world. So this is the first regime that Chris is trying to suggest in his paper. Secondly, the second regime that he suggests in his paper is the Southern Europe and the German speaking countries. He said that these regime will have a very low fertility rate, and they will also experience a very high immigration rate. So these countries, the Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy and all, and also all those German speaking countries, they will have a very low level of fertility, but at the same time they will also have a very high immigration rate. The third regime that Chris is talking about in his paper is about the developed East Asia. Now developed East Asia will include all the China, Singapore, Philippines, all these countries will come under the developed East Asia. South Korea, Japan, all these countries comes where the fertility has gone much below, but at the same time there is very little immigration there. So this is a third regime of the post demographical phase. He sees there is a fourth regime also, which is of the Eastern Europe, where he finds that the fertility in these countries, in the Eastern European countries, is very low, but at the same time there is high immigration. So these are the 4 different regimes that Chris is trying to put forward in his paper, and he suggests that these regimes require more and more research to confirm and to suggest for a better post demographic scenario, or the current demographic scenario in the developed countries. So this is what I was trying to explain in the post demographic countries. Now after this, I will come to the optimum population theory. Friends, we have already discussed a number of population theories, but I thought of discussing this optimum population theory, which is also a very important population theory in population theory. To be very precise, many of the scholars have not found it a population theory, rather they call it an economic theory. Why? Because this particular theory is more related to the marginal productivity of a country. Now in this particular theory, which was for the first time suggested by Sidgwick in his reputed book called Principles of Political Economy, and later on this particular optimum population theory was again contributed by Marshall, Dalton, West, Cannon and Robbins. These are the scholars which have contributed to the optimum population theory. So these scholars have tried to bring this, tried to develop this optimum population theory in economic terms. Now this particular optimum population theory got popularized after a famous book written by Carl Saunders called World Population. In his particular book, he tried to argue for the optimum population theory. What is this theory? As I said, this is not basically a population theory, but and why this is not a population theory? Because it does not give you a reason why population is increasing in any particular society, and also what determines the difference between the birth rate and death rate. These things you will not find in this particular theory, and that is why there are several scholars who suggest that this is not a population theory, that rather this is an economic theory. Now, what is this theory? Basically, this is a normative statement which attempts to define an economically ideal size of population in a country or in a society. So, basically it is an imaginary concept wherein the scholars try to argue that every country should have an optimum level of population which will lead to its maximum growth and maximum development. So, this is what this particular theory argues. Optimum population theorists state, or they argue, that population growth may be harmful or beneficial for an economy depending upon whether the increase is pulling the economy towards optimum or pushing it away from it. So, there are two scenarios. One, that there is a lesser population which is less than the optimum population. In that particular case, the economy will not grow, the development will not take place as it is desired. So, that particular scenario is known as the underdeveloped or the underpopulation. There is a scenario where the population is more than the optimally required size in a country or in a society, where the development, the growth process gets hampered, or the law of diminishing returns takes place because of the growth in the population. So, that particular stage, more than the optimal population stage, is called the overpopulation. So, now we have a three different situation. One, where there is a lesser population than that is optimally required for a country, which is known as underpopulation, and another is a situation where there is a more population than that is required in a country. So, these are the two different situations at two different ends, but at the center there is an imaginary or a normative situation which is known as the optimum population theory. Now, this optimum population theory is not a fixed. This optimum population is not fixed. Why it is not fixed? Basically, it is relative to resources and technology. So, in a country where we see that resources are much more, the population, the optimum population, suppose there is a country where given a particular resources, we find that particular country is having the optimum population, but all of a sudden the country discovers a large or huge pool of resources in their country. Now, those huge pool of resources requires manpower to tap those resources to develop that particular country. So, the optimum population will now become the underpopulation stage. Now, the optimum population stage, the level of the optimum population will increase to harness the natural resources, the newly found natural resources. This is one situation. Secondly, there are also cases of the technology improvement. So, in a society, if you find that the newer technology has developed, to tap those newer technologies, for tapping the newer resources, one finds that the optimum population now again increases. So, these are the situations where the optimum populations gets affected. So, it largely gets affected by two factors, one is resources and other is technology. So, that is why it is called as optimum population is not a fixed population, rather it keeps on varying according to the availability of the resources and according to the development of the new know-how of the technologies. So, this is what the optimum population suggests. Now, there are different scholars, they have tried to explain this theory with different graphs. So, there was a graph presented here which can be shown here, and you can see it on the screen now, that F1, F2, these are the optimum population level. Now, on the x axis we see the size of the population, whereas on the y axis we are seeing the national income. Now, you can see the earlier optimum population of F increases to F1, increases to F2. Now, this particular increase is taking place because of the availability or because of the discovery of the new resources in that particular country, and also because of the discovery of the new technology to harness those resources in that particular country. So, this is how this optimal population theory is being defined, being explained, that this is not a fixed population, rather this is a dynamic population, this is a varying population where it keeps on increasing or decreasing depending on the availability of the resources and technology in one country. Now, this particular optimum population theory, Dalton has devised a very simple formula to estimate whether a country is underpopulated or a country is overpopulated. Now, the extent of deviation, he calls that there is a maladjustment in the society. So, that is why he has given a very simple formula, which is A minus O by O, which means the actual population minus optimum population divided by optimum population will actually give you the status of a country. So, if you put actual population and minus it by the optimum population divided by the optimum population, then you will finally get the status of that country, whether that particular country is underpopulated or overpopulated. And this underpopulation or overpopulation stage is called the maladjustment, where he suggests that if m is positive, if you are finding the value of this particular equation in positive, that means the country is overpopulated. But if you are finding the result of this particular formula in negative, that means this particular country is underpopulated. So, this was a simple formula given by Dalton to estimate a country's status in the overpopulation or to estimate underpopulation and overpopulation. This optimum population theory was also criticized much. The optimum population theory was criticized because it was largely an imaginary concept which is very difficult to ascertain. Secondly, there was no political consideration because there are several situations where the politics has to interfere in the fertility decisions, where they have to increase the population or where they have to decrease the population. So, these factors have not been considered into this particular theory, and also that the optimum population is not a very rigid thing, it is a very loose thing which keeps on varying, which keeps on changing. So, these are some of the points of criticism that this optimum population theory has received. Now, having discussed this optimum population theory, now let me come to discuss some of the revisionist or neutralist theory. Now, as you can see, this revisionist theory is also known as the neutralist theory. What does this mean? This simply means that the revisionist scholars, they argued that population in development is a neutral phenomenon. So, this is what revisionists tried to argue in their theory. They said that the population should not be considered as a big factor, as a very influencing variable in the development of the mankind. Rather, it is a factor, it is not the only factor which hampers the development of the mankind. It is one of the many other factors that is leading to the development of the mankind, and that is why the revisionist theorists, revisionist scholars, they are also called as the neutralist scholar. Now, they contradict the pessimist view of the population theory. As we have seen, the Malthusian and Neo-Malthusian population, they largely proposed a pessimist view, or you can say the orthodox view, that population growth ultimately leads to misery, vices and several other problems. Whereas the revisionists said that it is not the case, they contradict this thing, and they tried to make the population factor in the development discourse as a neutral factor. So, they view the growth of population a fairly neutral factor in economic development. The main proponents of this revisionist theory was scholars at the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, which have brought couple of publications which tried to argue in the favor of the revisionist arguments. Now, in 1986, prior to that, also the National Academy of Sciences brought a publication wherein they tried to accept the fact that population growth leads to leads modestly, even at that particular point of time they said that it modestly hampers the development. But in their 1986 report, which was called as Population Growth and Economic Development Policy Questions, this was the name of the report that was brought out by the National Academy of Sciences. I repeat, the name of the report was the Population Growth and Economic Development Policy Questions. So, this was the name of the book, and this particular report came in 1986, and in this particular report they tried to put their arguments in the following words, which I quote: on balance, we reach the qualitative conclusion that slower population growth would be beneficial to economic development of most developing countries. So, they are arguing in favor of the population growth. They are saying that in the if a slower population growth is there, that might even help the developing countries to develop, because as we have seen in the underpopulation theory, that underpopulation also leads to the lesser development scenario. So, that is why revisionist theories, they argue that there is a need of a slower population growth for the development process in the developing countries. Now, this revisionist theorist, the neutralist theories, they said that the implication of rapid population growth vary considerably. The implication of the rapid population growth, they keeps on varying considerably depending on the different economic, cultural, institutional and demographic characteristics in the lower developed countries. So, the impact of the rapid population growth, the impact of the population growth is not constant, rather it keeps on varying according to the economic, cultural, institutional and demographic characteristics of the lower developing countries. So, this was another argument of the revisionist theory. They also said that population growth, as I already discussed, that population growth is not necessarily the principal cause. It might it might be one cause of the demographic, it might be one of the cause impacting the development process, but it is not the only cause impacting the development process. And this particular revisionist theorists, they said that it does multiplies the damage caused by other worlds. So, he said that though it is a very normal factor, it is one of the factor, it is not the only factor impacting the development, but this population growth may have certain influences on the development. So, if a world is facing development problems, it might multiply, population growth might multiply the developing process, whereas if a world is the slowing of the population growth can cannot solve problems, but can contribute to the solution. So, if the world is facing a number of population related problems, development related problems, so in that particular scenario, if a population is slowing, then that will also contribute to that particular solution. So, the revisionist main argument was that the population growth, they saw that if a world is facing problem, population growth might impact the problem in a limited manner, or it might accentuate the severity of the problem. At the same time, the slower population growth might help in impacting the solution of the world problems or the development related problems. So, these are the arguments that the revisionist theorists tried to put forward. Now, as you have seen earlier, they are trying to take a balanced approach here. They also signify the positive impact of the population growth, but at the same time they are also looking at the negative impact of the population growth. So they said that the actual, they basically proposed 4 different structures of this of their arguments, and in the first argument they are saying that it has both positive and negative impacts on the population growth. In the second argument that they are trying to put forward is that the actual size of the net impact and even whether it is strong or weak cannot be determined given existing evidence. So they are not very sure also that how far this positive and negative impacts is having on the development process. So they said that it is yet to be analyzed, it is yet to be studied, it is yet to be researched, it is yet to be a matter of research. Thirdly, they also say, the revisionists, they also say that the direction of the impact from high current growth can be discerned. So by this particular growth pattern, we can only see that if there is a society is having a very high growth rate, that might have difficulty in their development process. So the direction can be discerned, but actually the exact amount of severity or exact amount the impact of its on the development process may not be discovered, may not be discerned. Now the net impact varies from country to country, as I have already said that the revisionist or the neutralist said that the population growth will have a different impact in different countries. So there will be a better impact in one country, there might have negative impact in the other countries. So they said that it keeps on varying from one country to another. So these are some of the arguments that was put forward by the revisionist. Now I will come to the discourses that has taken place in some of the international population conferences organized by the United Nations. Friends, these international conferences on the population are very important conferences, and they also put forward some of the discourses of the population and development interrelationship. They had till date conducted almost 5 international conferences starting from 1954, which was held in Rome, which was called as World Population Conference. The second World Population Conference was organized in Belgrade in 1965. The third World Population Conference was organized in Bucharest in 1974, and then the fourth International Conference on Population was organized in 1984, and the fifth International Conference on Population Development, which was also known as ICPD, was organized in 1994 in Cairo, which was one of the very famous population conference. So these are the different population conferences that United Nations has organized so far, and in all these conferences they have tried to put some of the discourses on the interrelationship between the population and development, population and growth. So now let us see some of the discourses that has taken place in these conferences. So the first few conferences, first couple of conferences were basically looking at the trends and the patterns of the population in the world that they did not come to a conclusive point, but the conference that took in Bucharest in 1974, that was a very important conference, and in that particular conference for the first time the discourses of the international community, the discourses of the international conference emerged. Now the basic tenets of these international conferences was that development is the best contraceptive, and most interestingly this particular concept was put forward by Indian delegates in the Bucharest World Population Conference. They said that development is the best contraceptive, and this particular discourse should be adopted in all the countries rather than focusing on the population, rather than focusing on the control of the population. So they said that we should focus on development of the region. We should not focus on the controlling the population growth, rather than we should focus on development process, because development ultimately acts as a contraceptive, and that leads to the population decline, that leads to the lowering in the fertility rate, that leads to the decline in the population growth. So this particular conference also said that the societies where they are underdevelopment, they produce rapid population growth, whereas the societies where they are better development, where the societies which are highly developed societies, they have a very lesser population growth, or they have a negative population growth. So this was the main argument put forward in the Bucharest. Now, as you can see, they said that we should invest resources in development activities. We should not invest, focusing our resources in controlling the population growth. They also put forward a number of contraceptive methods, contraceptive techniques, and they emphasized on the making it available or making it accessible to the people. And they said that the pills, intrauterine devices and condoms are cheap substitute for aid, investment and access to markets. So these were some of the arguments that was put forward in the Bucharest World Population Conference. In 1984, the International Population Conference took place in Mexico City, wherein they tried to adopt the revisionist argument of the neutral phenomenon of the population, which I have discussed just a short while ago. So they said that population is basically a neutral phenomenon, and we should not be much concerned about the population growth, rather than we should focus our focus should be on the other priorities, rather than such as economic reforms, free markets, democracy. So the Mexico City conference, they basically adopted the revisionist arguments, and they said that the priority should not be controlling the population, but the priority should be economic reforms, free markets, democracy, etc. So they also suggested that the focus should shift towards reproductive and child health, to the education of girls and women access to earning opportunities. So in this particular conference, a major discourse was to improve the reproductive and child health, to improve the educational attainment of the girls, to improve the workforce participation rate of the women. So these are some of the suggestions that came forward in the Mexico conferences. In 1994, a landmark conference by the name of International Conference on Population Development took place. In this particular conference, which was attended by almost 179 governments of the world, they said, or they rather shifted the discourse from population control to people-centered development. They suggested that the development should be people-centered, and this is what our focus should be. We should not focus much on controlling the population, rather than our focus should be on improving the development, or taking the development or making the development as a people oriented, as a people centered. So this was one of the major discourse that took place in the ICPD conference. Another important aspects that was highlighted and adopted in this particular conference was the adoption of the human rights approach in population and development. This particular conference suggested that each and every population should have a basic human rights. They should have the basic human rights, and no one should hamper their basic human rights. If we are going to attain this, that will lead to the development of population. So by adopting to the human rights approach, what we ultimately come to the what ultimately results is it leads to the development of the population, it leads to the development of the people. So these are some of the major discourses that were adopted in this particular conference. There was a larger focus on the women empowerment, gender equality, as well as its role in the population and development. So they rather re-emphasized the previous population conference discourses, and they said that we should keep on focusing on the gender parity, gender equality, and gender empowerment. So, and that has a very positive impact on the development of the population. These population discourses also brought out several other factors which was ignored in other theories that we have discussed, such as they brought into the discourse about the issues of HIV/AIDS among the population, issues of population and environmental pollution, which was largely highlighted by the Neo-Malthusian. They also raised the issues or the interrelationship between the population and economics. They also highlighted the issues of the refugees flows from one part of the world to the another part. They also highlighted the issues of the trafficking of the people in different forms in different parts of the world, and they also highlighted the issues of the internally displaced people. So all these new population problems got highlighted in the ICPD conferences, not only ICPD conference but all the prior conference to it. They tried to take into account several other factors that impacts the population, and then that they tried to put forward their discourses. So in a nutshell, we can say that these population conferences have also enriched the discourses, the discussions on the population and development interrelationship. Now friends, herein we are ending with the population theories. I have tried to cover till now the population theories proposed by Malthus, proposed by Marx, proposed by Ricardo, proposed by Neo-Malthusian groups. There are several others in those groups, as we have seen, starting from Pearl, Ehrlich, Cole and Hoover, and there are people like Meadows and all. They tried to argue in the favor of Neo-Malthusian. Then we have also discussed about the optimist theory. In optimist theory, we have largely seen the role of Esther Boserup, Julian Simon, Donald Bogue. So they have tried to look the population from the optimist perspective. Then we discussed about the demographic transition. Today we have discussed about the post-demographic scenarios, taking arguments from the Chris Wilson recent paper. We also discussed about the optimum population theory, which was given in somewhere way back in 1934, and then we also discussed about the revisionist theory, which was largely given by the National Science Academy in 1986, where they tried to put the population in a neutral factor. And finally, we discussed about the discourses that is taking place in the international population conferences. So these are the theories that I have tried to cover in my 5 different lectures that I have given till now. And if I have to sum the entire theories together, I can say that basically no theory reflects the global pattern or the global population development interrelationship pattern. So these particular things can be understood from the perspective that the theory reflects each theory reflects some parts of the globe, but not all the parts of the globe. Secondly, there are myriad diversity in demographic, social, economic and cultural patterns which leads to the diversity in the population growth, and that is why not any of the theories is able to capture all these diverse things into one. thirdly, Malthusian and Neo-Malthusian theory suggest us, and very important suggestions that they provide us is that we will have to check the population at some point of time, so that we will not stress our environment, our resources, our commons, which was seen by the which was suggested in Neo-Malthusian theory, and therefore we will have we got some idea about checking the population from these theories. Lastly, optimist theories hopes of a better future, which is also a very important thing. So with this, I will try to I will thank all the viewers who have watched my observation on the population theories, and I thank all of you to hear me and raising important questions on these issues. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone.